This is Canada's National War Memorial on Vimy Ridge, and it honors 60,000 fallen Canadians from the First World War. Few people realize that 20,000 of those men are missing. The 12,000 names that are engraved around the bastion of the Vimy Memorial commemorate the Canadians missing in France. And every name has a story. This is Lieutenant Frank McGee, who is famous for scoring 14 goals in the Stanley Cup game and winning the Cup 3 times with the Ottawa Senators. He was killed at Courcelette in September 1916. He had a recorded burial, but it was later lost. His brother Charles was killed at Festubert in 1915, and he has no recorded burial, and he is also on the monument. Here's another story. Private William Johnston Milne, Victoria Cross. He was a Scot living in Saskatchewan when he enlisted, and he was killed in action April 9, 1917. And it was during this action he won his Victoria Cross. He was known to be buried in a cemetery near Tilou, but today he has no grave. Each missing man is an unfinished story, and for their loved ones at home, they simply vanished. Now, after 100 years, we can resolve some of the mysteries of the missing. I'm military historian Norm Christie. I've been touring the old Western Front for 30 years. By visiting the famous and not so famous cemeteries and battlefields, you'll get a unique perspective on the war and the men and women who fought it on the Great War Tour. We're driving through the rural countryside near Vimy Ridge, just north of the city of Arras. And it's beautiful today, but it wasn't always like that. During the Great War, tens of thousands of men were killed here. For 4 years, between 1914 and 1918, this was part of the Western Front, the front line between the Allies and the Germans. After the battles, the bodies of thousands of men killed were missing. Some of their bodies are still out there in the battlefields, and others are buried in the war cemeteries as unknown soldiers. We're at Cabaret Rouge British Cemetery near Vimy, and it's one of the largest war grave cemeteries on the Western Front. And like a lot of war cemeteries, it contains graves of unknowns. In fact, this cemetery has 7,500 burials, and 60% are unknown. This is the grave of an unknown soldier, a Canadian from the 54th Battalion. You can see at the bottom, like all unknowns, he has the Kipling phrase, "known unto God." There were 700,000 Commonwealth soldiers killed on the Western Front, and 1 in 4 is buried in an unidentified grave. And you have to ask yourself, how could this happen? There were several reasons. There were so many men killed that the dead really didn't matter. Survival mattered. Nobody was going to waste time on the dead. And in many cases, it was too risky because the shell fire was still on. You could get killed taking care of the dead, and to most men, that didn't make any sense. They had their own comrades they would grieve over, and they would want to bury their officers, they'd want to bury their friends, but they really, in the end, they were about themselves. They had to move forward. The living mattered, the dead didn't. After a battle, they'd have a burial team go out to take care of some of the bodies. Early in the war, they had a single dog tag system. So if they buried the soldier, they would take off his ID. So when they found him later, he was an unidentified soldier. But you have to keep in mind, over a small battlefield, you could have one battalion could attack and lose 100, 200 men killed. Nobody wanted burial detail. It was horrible. They're also on a battlefield that's still quite active. So what they would do is they'd throw him in a hole and put a cross on. Just a marker, they'd put his rifle in the ground, something to mark the grave. You have to remember, too, that that shelling would also blow a man to pieces, or if they made a grave for him on the battlefield, it could be destroyed in later battles. In the early years, they had no method of registering the graves. They had no people to go and bury them. There was no organization whatsoever. This meant that these men were being lost all the time. But in the early stages, it didn't matter. It wasn't until the Battle of the Somme in 1916 where they kept going and attacking over the same terrain, and the bodies of the British soldiers or Canadian soldiers were just lying there. And this was having a terrible demoralizing effect on the soldiers. And it was after this they decided to set up a directorate of grave registrations and inquiries to try to take care of the dead. But first they had to bring in all the bodies. Many of them are not registered in graves. Many are just on the battlefield in isolated graves, trapped in dugouts, anywhere they could find a body. So what happened is they had to create labor companies to go out and search the battlefields and bring in the dead. And that's how these cemeteries came. This cemetery is typical of them all. It has an original part of it, which is usually a couple hundred graves, maybe at the most. And now there are more than 7,000 graves in Cabaret Rouge Cemetery. After the war ended in 1918, thousands of bodies were brought in from the battlefields by the exhumation team, the labor companies. And to do that, they'd look for equipment, they'd look for rat holes, they'd look for mud of a different color, they'd look for grass where it was a little higher in some areas than the others, and they'd start to dig. And of course, they go down, they may find one man, they may find 30 men. The exhumation companies had the most gruesome task of all, because in 1919, 1920, there'd still be flesh on the bodies. They weren't that long dead. And they had to go around and try to find them. And then they'd have to exhume them, they put them on a stretcher, wrapped them in canvas, and took them to the open cemetery. They had a padre in the cemetery to give them the official committal service. The exhumation companies had not only the most gruesome work, but extremely dangerous. There was lots of unexploded ordnance here. There were gas shells. There were all sorts of dangers on the battlefield. And if you're digging, you had to be very careful that you didn't dig in the wrong spot or you were unlucky. One entire crew was blown up when they were cooking their tea inadvertently over an unexploded bomb, and they were all killed when it went off. The exhumation companies continued their work until mid-1921, and during that period, 1919 to 1921, they brought in 125,000 bodies, and these are the Commonwealth soldiers. And they filled up the cemeteries, and then at a certain point, the cemeteries would be declared closed. However, there were still tens of thousands of men unaccounted for. The action next was for the local people. They had what were called flying squads. So the flying squad would go out to a farm because the farmer would have found some bodies. And of course, to get the farmer to report this, they had to pay him a certain amount of money, because if not, he'd just throw the bodies back into the ground. It wasn't worth bothering for. Later on, during the rains, the wet winters that they have here from about 1925 to 1935, they were finding thousands of bodies every year. A dugout would wash away, and they would find 20 men, 20 New Zealanders. They'd find a bunch of Australians. They'd find Canadians, Indian troops. And this, again, is only the Commonwealth. This activity was going on for 500 miles from the Channel coast all the way to the Swiss border. There still are probably 60,000 Commonwealth soldiers unaccounted for on the Western Front. But inside the cemeteries like Cabaret Rouge, there are hundreds of unidentified soldiers in unnamed graves. For their families, these men are still missing. It's impossible to identify a soldier lost on the old battlefields. But for those who have been recovered and brought into a war cemetery, is there any way we can identify them, finally giving them a name and completing their story? We're driving through the countryside west of Cambrai towards the village of Sancourt. These were the Canadian battlefields of late September, October 1918. We're heading to Sancourt British Cemetery, where some of the men killed in the fighting around Cambrai are buried. In many Great War battles, we have great numbers of unidentified soldiers. But in the struggle for Cambrai, the Canadians drove the Germans off the battlefield. Since we have the identities for so many of these soldiers, can we identify the few who still have no name? For 80 years, this grave was an unknown Canadian soldier of the 85th Battalion, which was the Nova Scotia Highlanders. When I was records officer at the War Graves Commission, I reviewed the information. I examined the regimental records of the 85th Nova Scotia Highlanders and found out how many men were killed in this action and how many of those were missing. Then, by a process of elimination, by looking at the date of death and the rank of the soldier, I could determine who is buried in this grave. And we found that only one man of the 85th Battalion was missing in that action. We were able to change the headstone from an unknown to a known. And it's now the grave of Private Fred Lockhart, 85th Battalion, North Novus, killed in action 29 September 1918, and he was only 18 years old. So we finally finished the story. There are other examples of this in the cemetery. Here we have a grave of a corporal of the Great War, 1st Battalion Canadian Infantry. So we're looking for a corporal, 1st Battalion, October 1st, 1918. You can see the date is October 15th, 1918. That was the day he was buried, but we know he was killed October 1st because that was the day of the battle. And there's only one corporal of the 1st Battalion missed in the action on October 1st, and it was James Robertson, Military Medal of Dundas, Ontario. So they could actually put a name to this headstone. There are probably hundreds of Canadians that could be identified just by the process of elimination. The use of DNA has been suggested in some cases, but this would disrupt the cemeteries completely and would be unacceptable. But the process of elimination is a way to do it. I would suggest that there are thousands of Great War Commonwealth soldiers who could be identified. But it's been 100 years since these men died. So the question is, do we care enough about them to do it? We're on the way to Pheasant Wood Cemetery near Elms, the scene of a terrible Australian defeat in 1916, where they've discovered some remains recently. Elms is a quiet village in a rural area of northern France. It lies on part of the old Western Front that saw very heavy fighting. The remains of half the soldiers missing are still out there on the battlefields. When they are found, they are very rarely identified. But something extraordinary happened at Elms that shows that not all of the answers to the mysteries of the missing are found in the cemeteries. This is Pheasant Wood Cemetery, and it looks a lot like any other Commonwealth War Grave cemetery, except this was built in 2009. And the soldiers here were missing for almost 100 years before they finally got their due respect. Pheasant Wood is really a remarkable piece of historical detective work. An Australian historian did a calculation. He numbered the men in the cemeteries, known and unknown, that were missing in this action, and determined there was about 400 men unaccounted for. So he started to search through various records to see if there was any changes in this vicinity during 1916, and he examined the aerial photographs. And he found 6 freshly dug pits. And you have to remember, this was a disastrous attack for the Australians, so their dead were left in no man's land and in the German line. After the battle, the Germans disposed of the British and Australian dead, and they buried them in 6 shallow pits. What they were making was unmarked cemeteries. The Australian Army then got involved. They did the subsurface analysis. They found enough information to say that they needed to dig. On the basis of Lambis and Glazos' evidence, the Australian Army took a leap of faith and decided to try and find their long-lost men. This was a tremendous challenge. And they did dig, and they found 250 bodies. The Australians then went to all the next of kin they could find to try to get DNA, and that's why some of these men are identified. This is an amazingly difficult thing to do. But what you ended up with is really a great honor to the men of the Great War, and really to show them that they are not forgotten. When the new cemetery was ready, the Australian Army held a special ceremony to honor each of their dead comrades and complete one story of the Great War.
Dear Mum, I suppose you heard I got a slight crack on the 19th. It is very harmless, only a bullet through the left forearm and very painless. We had a very interesting evening on the 19th. We had to charge 450 yards to the German trenches, and didn't we catch hell? Machine guns and shells bursting all over the place. They mowed us down. You could see them go down in a line. The person was very lucky only to get wounded. There are only 29 of our battalion that didn't get hit, out of 1,000. Hope everybody is well. Your son, Frank.
If the Australians could recover and honor some of their missing men, could the Canadians? After all, Canada had 60,000 men killed on the Western Front, and the bodies of 10,000 of them have never been recovered from the battlefields and are still out there. We are going to a Canadian battlefield, the Battle of the Drocourt-Queant line, which is very similar to the Australian battlefield of Elms, since here there are a large number of Canadian soldiers who are unaccounted for. We are going to begin our search for these men in Drury Crucifix Cemetery, which lies on the old Drocourt-Queant battlefield. This is Drury Crucifix Cemetery, and we're trying to resolve a mystery. These first 2 rows of graves are men killed in action at Drury in September 1918, and most of them are identified. What we're looking for is what happened to the men who aren't here, that should be here. And this goes down to 2 units. The first unit, this is Private E.G. Donaker, 47th British Columbia Canadian Infantry, killed September the 3rd, 1918. His unit is missing a lot of men. Second one, Private F. Gardner, 44th Battalion Manitoba Canadian Infantry, also killed September the 3rd, 1918. And the system works like this. You have either a known grave or an unknown grave, and those 2 numbers should add up to the total dead in a battle. So this way, everything balances. The men of the 44th and the 47th, at least 60 to 70 of them are not accounted for. So where are they? We know they died fighting north of the village. Today, Drury is a quiet farming community, but in 1918, it was the scene of one of Canada's fiercest battles. So we're going along the main street and out to the battlefield where those Canadian soldiers disappeared. This is the north end of the village, and this is where the fighting took place. We know they attacked across these fields on September the 2nd and September the 3rd, and they were killed in action somewhere across here. 60 to 70 men who died, and they have no registered graves, so after the war, they couldn't find them. The unusual aspect of this battle is there are many more men missing than we would expect, since the battle lasted only 2 days, and we have burial reports for some of them. We know that some of them were buried by their comrades on the battlefield because we have their burial reports from the Canadian burial officers. One of them is Lieutenant C.H. Smith, buried where he fell, no map reference. Another, Private J.C. Beauchamp, has a map reference. It's unlikely that in a 2-day battle, their graves could be destroyed by shell fire. So there must have been some error in registration of the graves, and that the graves were later overlooked. I'm with local historian Jean-Marie Dez and his son, and we're looking for clues to the whereabouts of the Canadians who went missing on the Drury battlefield. Oh. Qu'est-ce que c'est?
C'est un poste de mitrailleuse allemand.
Dans la ligne droite-quiante.
Exactement, oui.
Ok, c'est une bonne position. Vous avez une bonne vue de
Bonne
l'attaque.
vue pour arrêter l'ennemi.
Ouais. Pour les Canadiens ici, quel bataillon est ici, près de Drury?
44, 47, 87.
Ok. Et fait comme ça. Il y a beaucoup de targets. Qu'est-ce que c'est le target pour le machine gun?
Beaucoup.
Beaucoup, beaucoup.
Beaucoup.
Pour les hommes ici, ils attaquent le village, oui? Et les autres? Beaucoup de Canadiens sont tués sur le champ de bataille, là.
Oui.
Vous avez trouvé beaucoup de pièces ici?
Oui.
Comme ça?
Oui, des gourdes, des chargeurs, des casques, des fusils. Mais des choses extraordinaires comme une gourde allemande avec de l'eau. Cette gourde qui contient toujours de l'eau.
Oh boy.
À gagner avec la cuillère.
La fourchette. C'est canadien?
C'est canadien. En tout cas, ça a été retrouvé ici, sur les positions canadiennes.
Oh, OK. So we know the Canadians were here because they left their mess kits behind. But what happened to their bodies? À quel jour est-ce que vous avez trouvé le trou?
Un dimanche, lors d'une promenade en bicyclette avec la famille.
Ouais, ici?
Voilà, ici. On est passé comme ça et on a vu cette ouverture.
C'est un peu dangereux dans le trou?
Aujourd'hui, c'est devenu dangereux puisque tous les boiseries ont été retirées après la guerre par les habitants pour se chauffer et se loger. Et donc aujourd'hui, c'est devenu dangereux. En plus, il y a 100 ans.
Ouais.
Et au-dessus, il y a des tracteurs qui passent. Ça pourrait s'écrouler à tout moment.
Vous avez beaucoup comme ça dans cette région?
Oui, beaucoup. Donc ça descend à 7 mètres. À peu près. 7 mètres.
7 mètres?
7 mètres. Et pour se faire une idée, avec un collègue, on a lancé un traîneau avec une caméra et un projecteur.
OK.
Pour voir s'il y avait quelque chose, s'il restait des traces de soldats, d'objets.
Objets dans ici?
Oui.
Comme, qu'est-ce que c'est?
Des casques, fusils, des masques à gaz,
Oh oui.
des restants d'alimentation, cornets de bif.
C'est une place pour les morts aussi, peut-être?
C'est aussi une place, malheureusement, oui, pour les morts. C'était un endroit facile pour se débarrasser des corps.
Ouais.
Et donc, après la guerre, je suppose qu'il y a eu des pratiques qui ont été faites comme ça.
This area is crisscrossed with tunnels and dugouts like this one, because as we've seen, it was a heavily fortified German position, now completely buried under the fields. That's probably where we could find the bodies of the Canadians of the 44th and 47th Battalions, who disappeared on the Jury battlefield and have never been recovered. Even though we have their burial reports, for some mysterious reason, we can't find the men. The trail has gone cold. But there are many mysteries about the missing we can try to solve. There are other Canadian battlefields, including the most famous Vimy Ridge, where thousands of Canadians are still missing. This is the battlefield of Vimy Ridge, just east of Neuville-Saint-Vaast. In particular, it was the battlefield fought over by the Canadian Scottish on April 9, 1917. These farmers' fields just south of Neuville-Saint-Vaast were once the bloodiest battlefield of the Great War. And it's hard to imagine today that these pretty fields would have been riven with trenches and mines and tunnels and dead bodies. This was an infamous battlefield. In fact, it was so dangerous that the men could not come to the front line overland. They had to take underground tunnels. And this is roughly the location of Bentata Redoubt, which was connected to Maison Blanche, which is the trees just over here, by an underground tunnel. And for the operations on April 9th, 600 men of the Canadian Scottish had to come underground through Bentata Tunnel into this position and then be funneled up to the front lines. This is a trench map of this area, and you can actually see all the different positions, all the names of the trenches, and this is the Bentata Redoubt, which is where we're standing. So the front line, in fact, is just over here, and it's just on the other side of the road, and that's where the Canadian Scottish are going to make their jump off on April 9th, 1917. There are several accounts of this battle by the Canadian Scottish. Interesting enough, the casualties were so high in the opening waves that you don't get too many memoirs. But one of the mopping up officers actually wrote a letter back. He was a man from the Bank of Commerce, and he sent his letter back to the boys at the bank to explain what happened on April 9th, 1917.
3 nights before the attack, my company moved into support trenches. It was impossible to get any sleep. The crash of our artillery was terrific. Then we received orders to go and relieve a company in the frontline trenches. The trenches were the worst I'd been in. Water up to the knees. We knew that the big attack was coming in a day or so, and all I prayed for was 1 night's rest.
The front lines were roughly along here, running parallel to the road that you can see up here. No man's land was about 125 yards across. And of course, for the Canadian Scottish, they had one distinct problem, is that no man's land was full of craters. Mining warfare was huge between the French and Germans in 1915, and they fired off hundreds of mines in this area. So no man's land was literally created by these underground mine craters. On one side of the crater was the Canadian lines, and on the other side was the German lines. And of course, the Germans had massed machine guns up there. And these were slimy craters. They were from the chalk. They were 20 to 30, 40 feet deep in some cases, some even bigger. And of course, they provided a huge obstruction for the attack on Vimy Ridge, April 9th, because it would funnel the attack. Therefore, if it funneled the attack through a tight passage, the German machine gunners could concentrate on them. And that's what happened with the Canadian Scottish.
Sharp on time, 5:30 a.m. Easter Monday, there came one big crash. The whole weight of our artillery swept the Hun line, and we walked out, following under our barrage. Lines of Canadian soldiers with intervals between, and on our right, a Scottish division with the kilts swaying and bayonets fixed. The noise was terrific, but above all the din of the big guns could be heard the rattle of the Hun machine guns as they endeavored to stop the rush of the Canadians.
The Canadian-Scottish attacked across these fields, and they were caught in heavy machine gun fire, particularly from the crater positions. And this is where most of their casualties took place. After they finally overwhelmed the Germans, they started to push on towards Tilou, and that's where their second group of men went down. After the battle, this area was strewn with Canadian-Scottish dead, and the burial officer had to come back and bury them. And they collected 44 of them and buried them in a crater, and the cemetery was called CA-40. CA-40 was a designation used by the Canadian Corps burial officer. C was for Canadian, A was for 1st Division, and 40 was for the grave number. And these graves were registered by the Canadian Corps burial officer and later passed to the Imperial War Graves Commission. The Canadian Corps burial officer registered all the graves, so it would have a name, CA-40. It would also have a distinct trench map reference right to this point. And the trench map reference was 51B A10 C97, and that's where the X is, right here, and it's right where we're standing. You can see roughly where CA-40 was. This is the crater position, or what's left of an old First World War crater, and you can see the ground has subsided, and you can see the shape of the crater. It's likely this is where the men were buried in 1917. After the war, exhumation companies came to these battlefields and picked up isolated remains in smaller cemeteries and concentrated them into the larger war cemeteries. CA-40, which was in this crater, was apparently exhumed and moved over to Nine Elms Cemetery over there. So therefore, we should be able to go over to Nine Elms and find them. This is Nine Elms Military Cemetery on the Vimy battlefield. It's one of the most important cemeteries that marked the battle, and I'm here looking for the grave of a Victoria Cross winner. Amongst the dead in CA-40 is Victoria Cross winner William J. Milne, whose name, with all his other missing comrades, is on the Vimy Memorial.
For most conspicuous bravery and devotion to duty in attack. On approaching the first objective, Private Milne observed an enemy machine gun firing on our advancing troops. Crawling on hands and knees, he succeeded in reaching the gun, killing the crew with bombs, and capturing the gun. He again located a machine gun in the support line and stopped this second gun as he had done the first. His wonderful bravery and resource on these two occasions undoubtedly saved the lives of many of his comrades. Private Milne was killed shortly after capturing the second gun.
The original part of the cemetery is over here. After the war, hundreds of graves were brought in from smaller cemeteries, isolated graves, and finally, you have this cemetery here. And some of the sites that were brought in were graves CA-26, CA-35, and CA-40. After the war, when the exhumation companies brought the soldiers in here, they filled out a form giving the trench map reference where the body was found, details of the body, and any particulars found on the corpse. Therefore, you know exactly where each man was buried. You can go plot, row, grave, all the way through the cemetery, and that's a ground check. We have the copies of the original documents here, and we can go grave by grave to find out if CA-40 is in fact in this cemetery. I've completed the ground check, and it's clear the men from CA-40 are not buried here. So where are they? I've looked for the men of CA-40 in a dozen different cemeteries where the dead of Vimy are buried, and they are nowhere to be found. But why would they be in the records as being transferred to 9 Elms if that is not what happened? Why would the records be incorrect? We have to remember that there were 700,000 Commonwealth soldiers killed on the Western Front, and 1 in 4 are buried in unidentified graves. Therefore, it was understandable that a clerical error could occur back in the 1920s when the War Graves Commission had taken on the enormous task of trying to account for all the men. So I believe that the men of CA-40 are still on the battlefield. So to properly bury them, we're going to have to do what the Australians did at Fromelles. But there is a big difference. The Australians were buried in shallow graves, but the Vimy battlefield, as we have seen, was full of mine craters, as the aerial reconnaissance photographs of 1917 show. There's Pheasant crater, Clodeau crater, and Zivy crater, which was later used as a cemetery. This is Zivy Crater Cemetery, and prior to the Battle of Vimy Ridge, it was just a deep mine crater near the German line. After the fighting of April 9th, the burial parties put 53 bodies in here. And after the war, they chose not to exhume them because the bodies were all entangled. I believe CA-40 is similar to this. It contains the 44 men of the 16th Battalion Canadian Scottish killed April 9th, and that includes William Milne, VC. I'm now convinced that the crater cemetery CA-40 is still in these fields, and it was never concentrated into 9 Elms or any other cemetery. So to prove they are here, we're going to have to dig in this field. We are meeting with Fabrice Poteau, our local liaison, to find out what's involved.
À mon avis, tu peux pas creuser comme ça, hein. Il faut poser la question à la sécurité civile, hein. C'est eux qui creusent, hein.
C'est très dangereux.
Peut-être.
Peut-être. Et beaucoup d'obus,
Ah oui.
de gaz.
Ah oui, oui.
And so we must meet with the local mayor and his council to make our case that the Canadians are still here. But Tilou was the site of many battles during the war, and many bodies have been found here.
C'est pas possible. Vous pensez que c'est pas possible parce que sur ce secteur-là, hein, sur ce secteur-là, il y a eu des fouilles qui ont été faites.
Ok.
Quelques corps. Voilà, une vingtaine. Mais ce sont essentiellement des soldats français. Ce sont essentiellement des soldats français lors de l'attaque des Français en septembre 1915.
Ouais.
Comme les cratères qu'il y a aux Canadiens, aux Canadiens sur la zone. Voilà,
oui, beaucoup. Broad Marsh.
On appelle ça des Canadiens.
Ce qu'on vient vous voir aujourd'hui, c'est pour vous demander l'autorisation de creuser. Si vous nous donnez l'autorisation de creuser, on va faire en sorte d'amener une équipe qui va être capable de creuser pour voir, pour découvrir ce quoi on vous parle.
Les fouilles ont été réalisées parfois à 4-5 mètres de profondeur.
Oui, mais 4-5 mètres, ce n'est pas...
C'est pas profond et insuffisamment.
Vous avez le type de cimetière à Zivy et Litchfield. C'est la même chose. Et vous avez la distance par la terre et le cratère.
Oui.
Et les tombes sont sous
Ils sont en dessous.
la terre.
Oui.
Je pense à 7, 8, peut-être 9 mètres sous la terre. Parce que c'est un cratère de mine. Ce n'est pas le cratère d'Obu.
Même si c'est plus profond, que les recherches qui ont déjà été faites, on veut aller plus à fond. Et puis, c'est ce qu'on a besoin de votre autorisation, on ne peut pas le faire sans vous.
Non, mais ici, la communauté élue, avec nos cousins canadiens,
Oui.
on a des liens très forts. Hein, donc
bien.
vous êtes les bienvenus, et si on peut vous aider, il n'y a aucun problème.
The mayor and the council of Tilou have given us permission to dig. It shows that even after 100 years, they still remember the men of the Canadian Corps who liberated their village. The next step in recovering the men of CA-40 is to get permission from the local bomb disposal squad, the Sécurité Civile, that it is safe for us to excavate this Great War battlefield. Ici, la place.
Oui, d'accord.
Aujourd'hui, c'est là. C'est dangereux ici pour Obu?
Oui, c'est un secteur assez dangereux. On va trouver énormément de munitions.
C'est pour métal ou acier ou...
C'est une sonde grande profondeur. Ça va enregistrer les perturbations magnétiques et ça prend uniquement l'acier et la ferraille.
Je pense que c'est la place ici pour les cimetières manqués. C'est là?
Oui, c'est sûrement ici.
So now we are on the trail of the missing soldiers of CA-40. 150 mètres d'acier jusque là.
Ouais, je vois bien. Ouais, ici, on voit bien un cratère aussi. Là.
Hey, oui, c'est la place.
Ouais, là, on va essayer de
We're
voir.
going to have to dig down 7 to 10 meters, just like Vimy Crater. Another challenge is more than 1 million shells were fired on this battlefield during 4 years of the Great War. Cette champ, c'est pollué
Oui, oui. oui.
parce que vous avez une autre place.
En dessous, à 100 mètres d'ici, ça a été dépollué. On a retrouvé énormément d'obus, mais cet endroit ici n'a pas été fait. Parce que la limite d'implantation de la zone se trouve à 100 mètres.
So, après 100 années, ils sont beaucoup d'obus ici.
Oui, oui, oui. On ramasse encore énormément d'obus dans ce secteur ici, dans le secteur de Neuville-Saint-Va, Tellu, Vimy. On ramasse encore énormément d'obus tout au long de l'année.
Et les fermiers, pas de problème avec...
Si, maintenant, avec les nouveaux engins agricoles, de temps en temps, il y a des accidents.
Oui.
Oui.
Hundreds of thousands of shells landed on these fields. Due to the faulty manufacture of timers or impact fuses hitting soft ground, thousands did not explode, but might easily detonate if disturbed by digging. Chemical weapons were also used by the armies fighting here, and even 100 years later, many shells containing deadly mustard gas are unstable and could be lethal if disturbed. So the bomb disposal crew must examine the ground to detect irregularities in the magnetic field. If there is a bomb or other metal object there, it will cause the detector to beep.
Un gros écho, là.
Mais c'est profond, à mon avis. C'est ça le problème.
Ouais.
The chief of the bomb squad is marking the field where the strongest signals are.
Encore. Ah oui, c'est profond, ça.
Ouais. Il y a quelque chose, mais...
Faut la pelleteuse. À la main, ça va pas le faire. Hein.
À la main, ça va pas le faire.
C'est combien de mètres?
Oh, à peu près
Bon, c'est au moins
1m20, 1m50,
Ouais.
là. Profond. Et c'est un gros truc. on marque l'impact pour revenir ensuite, pour terrasser à la pelle hydraulique. Parce que c'est trop... À la main, c'est trop profond. Vous allez fourrer le sol.
It will take some work before we can exhume the missing of CA-40. But this should be no deterrent to giving the men of the Canadian Scottish a proper burial. Clearing the battlefield of unexploded ordnance, exhuming the remains of the Canadian Scottish, identifying them, and reburying them in a war cemetery will take money and time. It's been 100 years since these Canadian soldiers went off to war. Many of them never came back and simply vanished in these distant fields of the old Western Front.
The strenuous work of April 9th is over, and the Canadians are resting on the field, wrested from the Hun. I can tell you the people of Canada have every reason to be proud of their boys out here. They did their work well, and the only trouble was to keep them back when our objective was reached. Everything went like clockwork and beyond all expectations. We put it over the Hun on every turn, and he surrendered in bunches. The taking of Vimy Ridge by the Canadians will long remain a red-letter day in Canadian history.
This potato field was once Canada's most famous battlefield, the battlefield of Vimy Ridge. And across these fields, the Canadian Scottish attacked April 9, 1917, and many of their men were shot down in this area. After the battle, 44 of these men were brought to a crater right here and buried, and the cemetery was known as CA-40. The records indicate that the graves were exhumed and moved to Elms Cemetery, and now we know that is not true. So now we can resolve the mystery of CA-40. The 44 men are still buried here. This is not proper commemoration for these men, and it's about time they got the respect they are due.